Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Just wanted to do a quick update here, not update, I guess, a quick lecture on equality, equity, and justice. And you're probably hearing these terms a lot recently, and the way they've been deployed and the way people are using them has brought me to reflect on, what do we mean? How are we using those terms? And what is the core of them, and how, some ways to think about them. So I just thought it would be a good time to stop and ponder these related terms. They're often deployed together. I'm sure you've seen them and heard them in various memes, and the language is out there a lot lately. And it's just an opportunity to reflect on that. And I think it's a good thing to reflect on and a good thing to discuss. But I often think they're being used in ways that we're not really thinking about them. And to what I do want to say at the beginning, one of the important things to ponder as we try and think about controversial, difficult subjects is so often disagreement is taken as some form of intolerance. And so I really want to emphasize that, particularly with terms of such subtlety and complexity, and which have such long-running, sort of philosophical histories. Just because someone can disagree with where you are doesn't mean they're intolerant of some bigger position or theme. And we'll talk about that. But I encounter this often, that people use these words not to begin discussions or explore ideas or talk about tactics and goals, but to sort of close down a discussion, because you just have to say, if someone says, "Oh, I'm for equality," then you have to say yes, right? As if that equality were some universal good, or equity is some universal good, or justice, as if we even know what justice is, right? So often this rather than being an opportunity to discuss, explore, expand these sorts of concepts and figure out how they apply in the real world, which I think is finally most important, they're just sort of like, oh, I've said the words, so everything, is good. We're all covered now, and we're all in agreement, right? So it's kind of a way of saying, oh, we're all good people, right? If we say equality, equity, and justice, then we all agree we're all good people, which is not the same, by the way, as achieving equality, equity, or justice. So, so disagreement does not equal intolerance. It's important to keep this in mind. And if we think about the terms individually, and then we'll sort of lump them together and see how they become very problematic. First we'll start with equality, which is clearly one of the core tenets of American Constitution. So generally, this is like the 14th Amendment. This is legal equality. That's really the core of it. And it's important to note that of all the many possible kinds of equality, one of the main, if not the main one in the United States, is the notion that everybody is supposed to be equal under the law. Now, it's been, let's just say a long journey trying to achieve that goal. I'm not sure we're there yet, but that's the core of the idea. And this comes from the historically, because people used to be not equal under the law. So if you were a foreigner, if you were a member of the aristocracy, if you were a member of the clergy, basically everybody's position in society had a separate set of laws and rules and guidelines and goals. And so that, like if you were a university student in the Middle Ages or late Middle Ages, you generally weren't subject to the laws of the city in which the school was located, which seems very strange to us, but this is true. And so you could go out in the city and, fight and brawl and burn things down. And as long as you made it back to the university grounds, you were all good, because they couldn't touch you, because you were generally under the protection of either the king or the duke or whoever the local ruling aristocrat was. And so your guidelines and the courts you would be subject to and the rules came from someplace else. And so that created, made the world very strange and complex. And so one of the founding ideas is like, no, everybody is equal under the law. We also have a strong ethos of equality of treatment. Again, not achieved in reality, but it's still one of the core ethoses there in the history of the United States, is this desire, drive to try and say, okay, let's treat people equally. And so, perhaps one of the most famous, not the most famous, one of the most famous would be the Brown versus Board of Education decision, in which it was sort of a double equality finding. One is there had been an earlier decision, I think like 1896, probably should have looked that up, that said, separate but equal, right? So that the schools for African Americans would be separate, but they had to be equal. And of course, let us just say they didn't far from equal. And so when Brown versus Board of Education came up, they said, A, it hasn't met the separate but equal stance, and the separate stance, it hasn't met the quality of the school stance, and it hasn't met the 14th Amendment's protection of everybody's subject to equal law. So segregation violates the 14th Amendment's equality of law, basically, and it violates the Supreme Court case where they had to be separate but equal. And so it was sort of this double, a lot of other constitutional nuances in there, but one way of thinking about it is this like double equality finding. And so a major case in the history of the United States and of the pursuit of equality. Now, equity, so again, if you think of equality, is the notion of treating everybody the same, right? So everybody deserves to be treated the same. This is one idea of equality, maybe same resources, same opportunities. And we'll talk about the different kinds of places of equality. Now, equity is quite different. Now, equity says, generally speaking, you can argue about the definition of equity, but in this context, generally it's being deployed is to say people should have not equality, but they should be treated according to their needs. And so I guess I saw a cartoon of this where it showed these kids were trying to look over a fence at a baseball game, and at first only the tallest kid could see over, and there was a medium-sized kid and a short kid, and then they said equality, and then they each got a box to stand on. So now the tall kid was way over the fence, the medium-sized kid could see over the fence, but the short kid was still so short that the box didn't get him to see over it. And then the next frame was equity. And in equity, the tall kid didn't get a box, he didn't need one. The medium-sized kid got the box that originally was there so he could see over. And then the short kid got a bigger box so he could see over, right? So equity has this notion of giving to people what they need to achieve some goal. And that because different people have different needs, then, different people you shouldn't treat them equally, you should treat them relative to their needs. And so this is the notion of equity, is, based on individual needs and situation rather than just treat everybody the same. And I think that that box analogy captures that sensibility. Another cartoon I like is there's like a fish, a monkey, a giraffe, a rhinoceros, and a bird. And there's a professor there saying, we're going to give you a test. Everybody just takes the test and we'll score you appropriately. And the test is climb the tree. And so, the monkey's going to do great. Nobody else is. And so the test is fair in that they're all getting the same test. However, because, the fish is not going to do that well on tree climbing, the rhinoceros is going to struggle a bit. The bird, I don't know, does it count if you fly up there? I don't know how you would grade that. Probably give them an A+ maybe. But that, right, so that the notion there is giving diversity of individuals the same sort of test, well, maybe tells you about their ability to climb trees. It really doesn't tell you very much about them. And so, this is the equity versus equality tension there. And finally, just to review the terms before we compare and contrast and look at some of the complexities, justice. Now, justice. So the problem with justice is it's not even clear, philosophically speaking, if we have a concept of justice. It really is one of the most vexed and explored terms in the history of philosophy. So Confucianism mentions, of course, Moism and legalism in the Chinese tradition, amongst others, Neo-Confucianism, communism, later Chinese communists have different rules again, all explored at length this concept. In the Western tradition, Plato's Republic, Plato's Laws, Aristotle's Politics, Aristotle's Ethics, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Just off the top of my head, there's the, that's like 20 major philosophical works from the Chinese and from the Greeks. And then, of course, you have the Roman. I mean, it has been one of the core philosophical problems throughout the history of people trying to think about these things. And so when, it's extraordinarily difficult to pin down. But generally what we mean is it's usually not, it's sort of the societal issue, right? Usually justice doesn't have a sense of two people. It usually has a sense of either an individual and a city or a state or a government or a king, right? It's like against a social environment, the individual and the social environment, or two larger social, two cities negotiating a treaty. Was it a just treaty? Was it a just war, right? A war between two people. Was the settlement, was the war reparations for Germany at the end of World War I just, right? So this is between two, or actually in that case, many state actors. So it usually has this notion of between the individual and the large state or social actor, or between two large state actors. And it associates, mostly, and it's sort of almost trivially, but it is the notion of, well, was it the good, right? Was the treaty, the business deal, was the court case, did it serve some ideal of the good? And of course the problem of what makes the good, and here we go, we're just you replace one vexed philosophical problem by substituting another vexed philosophical problem. What is the good? But this is the idea, is that so that, for instance, if we think equality is the good, if we want equality of education, then the Brown versus Board of Education would be a just finding. So as ranked by equality, it's a just finding. If they had found the other way around, we would say, well, that's an unjust finding because it does not meet this notion of the good. So, give or take, I think that's roughly it. But really, if you want to see a complex, difficult, challenging philosophical history, explore the history and development of the concept of justice in again, Islamic thinkers, different again, huge legal precedents. I mean, huge by, just vast, oceanic in scale, the legal and ethical thinking around the notions of justice in the Islamic tradition. Again, Chinese, Greeks, it's just overwhelming the amount of material there is out there. So it's not a simple concept, but I think, if you think about it, is a good as defined by something, context, being achieved between either large groups or between an individual and a large social group. I think, roughly speaking, we can go with that as a definition of justice. Now, where does this get difficult? It gets difficult in application. So let's start with a fairly abstract, although real world example, and then we'll get to a very specific one, actual one. But let's imagine you're a teacher. Taking these close to home here. And let's say you're a math teacher and you're teaching, say sophomore algebra or pre-calculus or something. And in your class, you have two students. They are just excellent, right? They've got the skills, they've got the background, they've had the training. They're going to go, they can be like mathematicians, researchers, high level. They've got it all, right? So you've got these they're just spectacular at math, and the more you give them, the better they're going to be, and their future looks bright. Then you've got your regular students there, middle of the ground. They're doing their work. They've done well. They'll probably pass on. They'll do well enough that, if they want to pursue the sciences, they'll be able to pass calculus and, do what they need to do to get into the sciences. Then you have sort of your, sort of bottom students down there who, for whatever reason, they're uninterested. They'd rather do other things. And, they've never caught fire with math. But maybe if given the opportunity and given a lot of attention, they might be able to have their interest stirred, and you'd find out how they are. And finally, at the very bottom of the class, you have some students who've say transferred in from another district, and they've just never really had an opportunity to even learn math, right? So their district was terrible. No one cared about it. They're coming in almost at zero, right? And so who knows if they're good or not, because they never had an opportunity to find out. They've never been in an environment that allowed them to shine or thrive or be exposed. So if you look at state curriculum, if you look at these sorts of things, What they would say is, well, we're going to treat them all the same. We have an equality. This is generally the goal of education. We have this equality marker that says, well, treat them all the same, and that's the most fair because, this is, everybody gets the same test and everybody works to the same goal. And in fact, in Washington State, and most states have this, the state superintendent of schools says the goal of the school system is to provide all students with an excellent education that prepares them for everything. I mean, so that's, it's this bizarre never land where, we're going to give everybody the same, and that way everybody will do well, and then that way everybody will be prepared for everything, which is of course impossible, but this is the goal, and there are very clear standards that are supposed to be met, and everything's, clearly lined out. So great. So that's equal, but notice it's not equitable because you're essentially holding back the very top students, even though they would shine and do very much better if they were given extra attention, extra assignments, and more, opportunity to explore their capacities, they would rocket up. The bottom students basically are going to be left out because they need extra time, they need extra attention, they need extra work to just, be brought up to speed through no failing of their own. They've never been in an environment where they have the opportunity to learn these things. And so basically you're throwing out the bottom and the top, and then the students in the middle, probably they'll do fine. They'll probably do just about how they're doing. Now is that just? So on one hand, you could say it is just because they're all treated the same. On the other hand, you could say it's unjust because you are basically throwing out the bottom, just saying, well, too bad for you guys. Not our fault you didn't learn math and didn't have this opportunity before you got here. And you're hindering the top. You're saying, well, yeah, you could do better, you could do more, but we're going to, you just take the same tests, you do the same homework, you get the same amount of class time as everybody else. So, basically you don't have an opportunity to learn and excel. And of course we think, well, that's bad. The problem is you have a finite resource, and this is one thing to think about. Anytime you're in a finite resource environment, in this case, the attention and time of the instructor, she's only got so much time in her day to teach math, and she has so many students, and she has to make these decisions, which every teacher makes all the time, about what's the best way to distribute her attention, her capacities, her tests, how to create grading systems, all of these questions, right? In some cases, in the case like this, equality really doesn't line up with equity, but to achieve equity, because there's limited time, I could see it to be reasonable ethically to say, no, I'm going to take most of my time and spend it on the very best students and the very worst students. And everybody in between, they'll probably be roughly the same anyway. Or you could say, you know what, I'm going to really focus on the bottom half of this class because some of those students have had opportunity. I want to see them have a chance to excel. And those other students, maybe I can get some of them to catch fire, and then they'll move them up. And the top half of the class, however you want to think about it, they'll be fine. No matter what happens, they're going to be fine. And if you want to excel, that's on you. It's not my job to help you excel. I'm here to give you a baseline. If you want to excel, that's your responsibility. Or you could say, look, why wouldn't we put our resources into those students who are doing the best rather than resources into those students who are like, who knows how they're going to be, or they're just not doing that well? I can see an argument for every case. Now, generally what people say, oh, well, we should get more resources for everybody. Well, yes and no. At some point, and this is an abstract one, there is a finite amount of certain kinds of resources. This is where equality before the law, there is no finite amount of the law, right? So equality between the law doesn't, draw down any sort of resources. And that's why that sort of equality is different from something like equality in a classroom, right? This is a distinction. And it's important to note, what kind of environment are we talking about? Are we talking about distributing scarce resources? Or are we talking about sort of abstract concepts or abstract structures where there's, essentially an infinite, you don't get less law as you make more people treated equally within it. That doesn't work that way. So this teacher has to make a decision, or many decisions. And when they make those decisions, they are trying to do what is essentially, I guess in this case, just, if you think of it as a representative of a system. Is that just? Have I done something that's right? Have I done something that's ethical for this group of students. But notice that in this case, the notion of equality and equity do work somewhat at cross purposes. They don't always feed back into each other. And if you ponder and stop and ponder this, what you'll realize is if you assume that people are widely variable in their talents and capacities, which I think I would say that's one of the few facts that I would take as, boy, this is really factual, right? That just people are so hugely diverse. They have different intellectual, emotional, artistic interests, physical, every possible, capacity that humans have is distributed unequally. And so you just have this huge variation in human abilities. And the more equitable a system is, the less quality you should expect. I think of it, the analogy I like to keep in my mind is wheat field versus rainforest. So too often, and I think this is where something like communism goes wrong, is it imagines humans beings as wheat fields, right? We're just going to give everybody the same, treat everybody the same. Everybody's going to wear the same uniform, the Mao jacket. Well, what if you didn't look good in a green Mao coat, right? What if you wanted to look a little more stylish? If this is the things you cared about, well, that doesn't matter because we're going to treat everybody like they're a wheat field. You have this uniform field. Everything's the same height. Everything's the same color. Everything is developing at the same time. There it is. Versus something like a rainforest where, frogs aren't trees, trees aren't orchids, right? Tree frog's good, tree's good, orchid's good, right? But they're totally different. And in my mind, I think people are much more like rainforests than they are like wheat fields. And anytime you try to treat them like wheat fields, you get injustice because a frog doesn't want to be wheat. It wants to be a frog. And a tree doesn't want to be wheat. It wants to be a tree. And it has the capacities to be, huge and tall and big. And somebody else has the capacity to be, beautiful and floriferous and smell incredible, right? So whatever, that just in my mind, that immense diversity of a rainforest is what you would expect with equity, as opposed to often the overpressure on equality tends to lean towards something like a wheat field. And you can see this again if you take a class of those math students and you only have finite resources and you treat them all the same, the curve of the outcome will be very much smaller. You'll probably be more finite because you'll get more students doing well, and the best students can only do so well. And so, and you often see this in schools, right, where you get classes that are almost entirely B pluses, A minuses, and A's. This is a very small range. But if you made a class and you said, oh, wow, let's make the top really, let's make an A virtually impossible to get, right? Only 1 or 2 students a year is going to get an A. And then at the bottom, the worst students are probably going to fail. You get this much greater diversity of outcome that reflects probably more accurately the incredible diversity of the capacity of the students and including the background in all this. And so, how much diversity do you want? How much diversity in the outcome do you want? Is, what would be the ideal reflection of the diversity of human capacities in a system that was equitable? These are really hard questions, by the way. This is why I think it's a great discussion. These are discussions that need to be had, but they aren't simple discussions. There's nothing obvious or unsubtle or uncomplicated about any of this. So this is where you see the tensions between equality and equity. Another part of this, of course, is, you have the equity, you have the variation of human capacity, which I just think is a given. But we have maybe even larger, but we have massive variation in human opportunity or background, right? So talking about equality of background, saying, look, there are certain minimums, people should have food, people should have a safe environment, people should have access to a quality education, right? So if you look at those baseline issues, maybe we want a certain baseline equality in that. And that if we achieve those baseline issues, then the equity on top of that baseline would produce even perhaps greater diversity, right? Because people are starting and have the ability for their many, many different talents to flourish in very many different ways. So this, so that there are times when they also work together, but there's also times when they work at cross purposes. And then figuring out what's just or fair in this case is it's really difficult. Another example here, and this is much more specific to our time, is people get upset. A big debate going on about the Black Lives Matter movement. And you can think of this as an equity, one way, not the only way, as an equity versus equality argument. And so I think Black Lives Matter is an interesting and good articulation of the problem of equity, because it's like, yes, given the history, obviously, and the context and the violence and all this, there's been a huge unequal treatment of the African American community by the police and the justice system at large. And so Black Lives Matter is basically an equity claim. We're not saying we want the same. We're actually saying we want special treatment because of the environment and because of the background and the history. Now, this upsets some people. These are the all lives matter people, I would say, if they're thinking at all, who say, no, well, we should be pursuing equality of treatment, not equitable treatment. And it's like, that's not crazy, right? This is not like nuts. But the way you can test this, however, and find out if this is an actual disagreement that doesn't mean intolerance, or whether this is just sort of crypto racism, is this way, is to go, okay, if you think all lives matter and you don't like the equity sort of Black Lives Matter rubric, then what are you doing? You should still support the notion of reforming the police. You should still support the notion of reforming the prisons. You should still support the notions of trying to do something about this sort of state-sponsored violence, I guess is for less good term here, because sure, some white people get killed at a vastly lower rate, by the way, but they do, and that's wrong too, right? So you can actually have a broad agreement on goals, even if you come from one as an equality argument and one's from an equity place. And you can say, well, look, I like the equality argument more, but look, our goals are precisely the same, right? So if that's the case, that's why I say it doesn't, just because there's disagreement doesn't instantly mean there's intolerance. However, unfortunately, in this case, too often that all lives matter is being used as a sort of just cover to say, well, they don't want to do anything about it. They just like things the way they are. And then you go, oh, no, this really is your notion of all lives matter is a way of avoiding addressing these core issues. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You could say, look, I just lean much more to equality. Let's see if we can't all work towards reforming this unfortunate structure of systematic police violence together. And somebody else could say, yeah, I want to do that, but I want to do that under the Black Lives Matter equity issue because it so disproportionately affects the African American community. No reason those people shouldn't be able to work together. In fact, there's every reason they should be able to work together. Yet, too often, those are really difficult dialogues to have, and the reflex is to say, if somebody says all lives matter, say, oh well, we'll just it's crypto racism, which it may be, unfortunately, but not necessarily. And so you want to have at least allow that space a little bit to find out and say, hey, if this is what we're about, you're really emphasizing the equality. I want to emphasize the equity, but that creates a shared goal that we can agree about. There you go. And then here's where we jump to the justice notion. And then if you can get reform, then, of some kind, as we are getting some reform, you're moving incrementally closer to this notion of a just system that benefits everybody, right? And in this case, this is the magic of the equality, equity, justice thing. If the system becomes less violent, fewer people are getting shot overall, it becomes more equal, but because African Americans are more disproportionately affected, equality in this case is equitable. See how that works? It's bizarre. So because if police violence was reduced by, let's say, 50%, then just cut in half, I mean, that would be dramatically greater impact on the African American community because the rates of which they are subject to this violence is much greater. And so while it would be an equal change, drop of 50%, it would have an equitable outcome because the African American community would be disproportionately, it would benefit them disproportionately. And I would say, are we 50% of the way to justice in that case? I don't know. But so it would certainly be more just, more equal in one way, but also more equitable in another way. So sometimes equality and equity reinforce each other. So it's this it's really case by case. It's a very subtle feedback, ebb and flow of these concepts. And so sometimes, again, equality and equity reinforce each other, and you can get equitable results that come from equality. Sometimes equality works against equity, or equity works against equality. There's a tension between them. And pursuing equality creates problems for equity, and producing equity produces problems for equality. And sometimes I just think there's confusion. Like I said, I think the all lives matter thing, when it's not just being crypto racism, is just a confusion basically about going, oh, does it really matter if we call it Black Lives Matter, or if we just say, let's reduce police violence? Let's just, let's do the equitable thing. But what I really want to focus on is this other goal, larger goal, perhaps one could say, of justice. So these are the sorts of problems that one encounters. Another part of the equality equation that people get frustrated by and try to think their way through is this notion of equality of outcome. And this is back to what I was mentioning to the superintendent of schools in Washington State, where they say, we want everybody to have an excellent education, which of course misunderstands what the word excellent means, right? You can't all excel, because then everybody would be the same, which is of course the opposite of excelling. But they don't want to say that. They don't want to say we want everybody to have the opportunity of a diverse expression of their human capacities. It doesn't sound good on a t-shirt, I think, is why we don't say that. But I think that would be closer to an actual, both attainable and interesting and human goal. But people do worry, and I think reasonably, about this notion of equality of outcome. If you have a system that you expect to produce equality of outcome, you have to explain why, given that human beings are so wildly diverse, that you would expect anything like that. Now, in some things, perhaps, but in most things, this is just it's crazy. You should not expect it. And if you have human beings and you give them freedom and opportunity, what you should expect, again, is rainforest, diversity of outcome. In fact, perhaps the greater the diversity, the healthier your system, perhaps the more human your system to think about. And so when you think of equality of something, are we talking equality of opportunity? Are we talking equality of resource access? Right? Because people, again, sometimes equality of opportunity says, well, everybody has a chance. And you're like, yes, but if I have a chance and I come from a background where, of wealth and, maybe private tutors and everything, and then I apply for college, and somebody else comes from an impoverished background with none of that access and from, some crappy school, they also have an opportunity to apply for college. However, is that an equality of opportunity? Yeah, it doesn't seem that much equal of opportunity, right? That clearly seems unequal. So, you have to define, again, what do you mean by equality of opportunity? Are we all starting from the same place? Again, back to the equity notion. Or is it really a case where, yeah, we do have pretty much equality of opportunity, where people are getting, give or take, within the vagaries of human society, than what you would expect. And is it clear? I think the clearest thing is if you look at, any sort of athletics, like physical education, which I think is grossly underappreciated in schools. We should do vastly more of it. But if you just took everybody from any class, so you got an 11th grade class or a 9th grade class, and you said, all right, everybody line up, we're going to run a mile. I can't even imagine what the range would be. But, you probably have somebody who's really good and who's going to be skilled, who's going to maybe be around the 5-minute mark, maybe even better, who knows, and then you probably have people who are it's going to be a while, right? They have no interest. They do not want to run. Their knee hurts and they're like, no. And so they're going to walk. And so they're probably going to take, 8 minutes, 10 minutes to walk that mile. And so you would have this dramatic diversity. Now, if you trained them and you said, all right, we're going to spend a year getting everybody trained up, at the end of the year, you would probably shrink that range, but not that much. I mean, you could probably get the worst students up a bit. And the fastest students, of course, you get that diminishing return where to go from a 5-minute to a 4:30 is really hard. To go from a 4:30 to a 4:20 is, impossible, right? I mean, it's sort of those curves in any sort of physical environment. But I think it's the same. For some reason, we don't think that our intellectual capacities work under those same sorts of rubrics, but I think clearly they do. I think all the evidence is absolutely they do. Some people can look at something and draw it. I mean, I can't hardly write my name. I'm always it just pisses me off. I always want to be able to draw. Some people can hear something and sing it by ear. They can reproduce it perfectly, pitch right on pitch. Maybe they have perfect pitch. They just, boom, they're there. They've got it. Well, you hear it one time, here we go. Remember it, play it, sing it, no problem. My mind just does not work that way. But I can read something and it sticks in my mind. I have no idea why. I read something, it's in my mind. It'll hang around there for the longest time. And other people say, I read that 5 times. I don't remember a word of it. And it's like, yeah, clearly minds work differently. And it doesn't mean they can't be trained up. It doesn't mean those gaps can't be narrowed in some ways. But in the other way, if you really do train people up, you should maybe expect the bottom to come up, but you should expect the top to go further away. Right. And so, yeah, this is that notion of equality of opportunity versus diversity of outcome versus equality of outcome. Where do we want to land? And when does pursuing equality of outcome impact the notion of you're reducing the diversity of human capacity? When is it, however, reasonable? So, for instance, if what you're trying to measure the outcome of is, like healthcare of some kind, you're like, oh yeah, if people of roughly equal health come in, we should really hope our system produces sort of equal results. It doesn't, by the way. So, but it would be nice if it did, if there weren't these, because of poverty and different systems in different places, that there is quite a diversity of outcome. That's a place where we'd probably like a less diverse, outcome, much more of the top end of the outcome. No reason that we should have this huge diversity. Again, in other places, no, it doesn't help. It's not a measure of goodness. It's actually a measure of the restriction of human opportunity for self-expression. And so, which is just, is a healthcare system that has unequal outcomes and expression of just variation of human capacities? Probably not. No, this is probably unjust. On the other hand, if you had some sort of physical education class where all the students performed exactly the same, would that be an excellent measure of equality and justice? No, that would probably be a measure of injustice, where students have been artificially either pushed up or restricted. So yeah, wow, lots there. So how do you unpack this? And this is back to where I started from, where it's like, disagreement of these incredibly complex, interlaced, historically, specific and often abstract concepts of equality, equity, and justice. Disagreement does not equal intolerance. Disagreement doesn't mean somebody here is evil, is just, trying to avoid an issue or something. There is a huge range of opportunity for thinking and reflecting about what sorts of worlds we want to inhabit and how best do you achieve them. And again, the way to look for this is to go, okay, let's take let's think about what it is we're actually talking about, right? Because equality doesn't mean anything. Equity doesn't mean anything. Justice doesn't mean anything in the abstract. I mean, we can think about them that way, but generally what we're worried about is what do we mean in the concrete? And if you can look at whatever it is you're trying to address, police problems and brutality or education or healthcare or poverty, and go, okay, what would equality look like? What does equity say? Where does justice land? How many different ways are there that we could approach this? And believe me, in any of these cases, there will be dozens. And see if you can figure out, where does equality work with equity? Where do equality and equity, where do they have those tensions? What would justice look like? And if you start with those sorts of questions rather than answers, if you start with those kinds of questions, it's much easier to explore and discover and, get deeper and broader insights and multifaceted insights. But if we start with an answer, if we start, we already know what equity is, we already know what equality is, and if you know what justice is, I mean, congratulations, you're the first thinker in human history who's been able to work this out. Then it tends to shut down debate, and then we're just saying, well, who's the good guys and who's the bad guys? And if you're a bad guy, then everything you say is wrong. And if you're a good guy, we tend not to discuss it, and we just nod at each other as if we know what we're talking about, when generally we have no idea. So opening up these discussions by exploring these concepts, that's where I think the real opportunity for both change and meaningful and hopeful change that will give us a world that more reflects the robust possibilities of human capacity. Hopefully, as I mentioned, will become increasingly like a rainforest, where a whole range of possibilities for human beings is expressed and lived and vibrant, right? Everybody is vibrant, even within the concept of vast diversity, as opposed to a wheat field where, what we've achieved is some sort of homogeneity that is clearly, it's bad for wheat. Wheat shouldn't be grown that way, and certainly not people. That's not necessarily a good outcome. And trying to explore how those tensions interact with each other, that's what we want to think. So just a quick reflection there as we talk about culturally, socially, as we're doing a lot of this exploration these days on, what do we mean by equality? What would it look like? What do we mean by equity? And what do we mean by justice? Because hopefully, for all of the problems and all the difficulties and all of the sort of glib responses that people give, these are really good questions. They're not necessarily great answers. They're great questions. Because if I ask the question of, is it profitable? Is it efficient? That's a totally different world than if I ask, is it equitable? Is it just, right? Does it foster equality? Much better set of questions over here. But they're questions. There really are questions that need to be explored. But they're not answers per se. The answers come from the exploration, not from just throwing those terms out there. Thank you very much.